Hey guys, so now that we've seen how the U.S. has mobilized and gotten ready for war, we're going to take a specific look now at the different parts of the war. So you will notice on your chart, this is called the War Theaters chart. So if you don't know really what I mean by theater, a theater is kind of like the different fronts that you fight in a war. So this specific war had several different places where people were fighting, hence the term World War, right? So some of them, obviously took place before America got involved, and then once America did get involved, it changes a little bit. We, change the dynamic of the war as a new ally will. So we're actually going to be jumping a little bit back in time, right up into Hitler's invasion of Poland, just to kind of see how the war progressed. You should be able to get a good picture of how it changed throughout the war itself. So just as a reminder for you guys, there are two sides of this war. We have the Allied powers and the Axis powers. So the Allied powers at the beginning of the war are France and Britain, as well as some other countries. France eventually falls to German control. The Soviet Union had a pact with Germany at the beginning that changes sides in the middle of the war. I think you'll see why in just a few minutes. And obviously we were not involved at the beginning. So these are really the Allied powers by the end of the war. The Axis powers were primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan. Spain was a part of it, as well as some other countries as well, obviously. These are just kind of the biggies. So that's kind of where we are. So I will put on my helmet, and we will jump right in. So the first major front of the war is the Atlantic Front. Basically, the Atlantic Front is the naval battles of the war. The original goal of this is the naval blockade of Germany. It's also called the Battle of the Atlantic. So you'll notice that there's a lot of similarities here between this and World War I. Basically, the Germans are using their U-boats in order to attack ships in the Atlantic Ocean. So we're doing a very similar kind of idea to use convoys or groups of ships in order to protect the vessels which are going back and forth. The idea also here is to eliminate the threat of submarine warfare. This had become a really dangerous form of warfare. Now Germany, what they were doing is something called the German wolf packs. So this is, you can kind of think about like the way that wolves hunt, right? So what they would do is the U-boats or the submarines would be underwater, and they would like spread out, right? And if they found a boat that they would want to attack, they would radio the other German U-boats and be like, hey guys, you need to come to this coordinates. And all of the U-boats would converge on that one spot. And so suddenly you've got like all these submarines that are converging in this one spot and attacking this one ship, which made it really hard. This is not really one specific battle, obviously. The whole thing is known as the Battle of the Atlantic. So it begins at the very beginning of the war in 1939 and lasts till the very end of the German surrender in 1945. It is an Allied victory here. Winston Churchill said that the Battle of the Atlantic was really the only thing that ever scared him during the war. He says, the Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor throughout all the war. Never for one moment could we forget that everything happened elsewhere on land or at sea or in the air ultimately depended on its outcome. Because remember, this is where they're getting supplies. Think about like during the cash and carry and the Lend-Lease policy. This is where men are coming in and out. The Battle of the Atlantic is basically the one protecting mainland Europe and attempting to cut off Germany as well. So you can see here, this is just a photograph of some of the convoys, what that might look like. This particular map shows some of the different naval battles that took place throughout the Atlantic. You can see they even go as far down as Africa and into the Mediterranean. So this was a pretty intense conflict for both sides of the war here. The second one that we're going to be looking at is the European front. So the European front is the main brunt of the war. So for the Allied powers, they're trying to stop Hitler's conquest of Europe and spread democracy. For the Axis powers, specifically for Germany, Hitler has a desire for what he calls Lebensraum. This translates into living space. Basically, he's trying to spread German control into territory that he believes belongs to Germany, primarily in Eastern Europe, but also in France and, Austria and other parts of Europe. So at the very beginning, the Germans are doing this thing called the Blitzkrieg. And the Blitzkrieg translates into lightning war. So basically Germany is hitting as many places as they can as fast as they can. They roll in their tanks, flatten the area and move out. By June of 1940, France officially falls to Germany. This is something that Germans were never able to do during World War I. They established what's called the German Vichy, which basically means technically France is their own independent country, but really they are controlled by Germany for pretty much the rest of the war, at least until 1944. The next major battle after they take control of France, starting in June of 1940 and lasting through August, the Germans use France as a launching point to bomb British cities in an attempt to try and invade Britain. If Britain falls to Germany in 1940, the war is over at that point, even before America gets involved. If Germany invades Hitler, or invades England, rather, they've taken over all of Europe, and that's it, right? Hitler would have won the war in 1940, and we would be done. So for several months here, major cities in Britain, like London, are being bombed pretty regularly every night. The Luftwaffe is the German Air Force. They are coming in, dropping bombs, leaving. The city of London is just completely destroyed by bombs. If you've ever seen like the movie The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, at the beginning of the movie, how they send the kids out to Germany, or they send out to the country, a lot of children did leave the cities. Parents would send their children away for their protection. For a lot of time, they thought that maybe Britain really would fall. However, they did not. In October, they had driven the German planes out. And for pretty much the rest of the war, it was going to be a battle on the Eastern Front in France between the Germans and the British. So we're going to skip ahead here. There's a lot of battles we could talk about, but really the one that's the most important is the D-Day battle of June 6, 1944. So D-Day was planned by General Eisenhower of the American Army, as well as Churchill, FDR, Marshall, who was one of the leaders of the British Army. And the idea here was that we needed to liberate or free France from German control. So France had been in German control for 4 years. We had basically lost an ally because of that. So D-Day, also known as the invasion of Normandy, the men landed on the Norman coast in order to go into the country. They actually had tricked Hitler into thinking that they were going to land somewhere else. However, they invaded the beach. It was an amphibious attack, incredibly successful. They managed to drive the Germans back, and over the next few weeks, eventually made it to Paris and liberated France. So yay, we drove the Germans back. After that point, for the next 6 months, we are continually pushing the Germans back. At one point in December, the Germans try one last time in order to defeat the forces. This is at the Battle of the Bulge. It gets its weird nickname because the German line kind of bulged out a little bit as they gained some ground. However, it's pushed back, and so this is the last German offensive. When it eventually falls, this is going to be the end of the war for Germany. Some of the major people that we have here, we have Churchill, who's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, FDR, obviously. Eisenhower is going to be kind of the lead general on the European front. In France, we have a general named Charles de Gaulle. He's going to go on to become a pretty famous French leader. For the Axis powers, we obviously have Hitler and Mussolini. Then there are 2 German generals, Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, are 2 of the major German generals. The years, again, of the European front, from 1939 to 1945. The outcome, eventually, is the German surrender. Hitler cannot face the surrender of Germany himself. He commits suicide with his mistress, Eva Peron, and the official surrender of Germany comes on May 8th, 1945, a day that we can now call VE, or Victory in Europe Day. So that was the end of the first major part of the war. Kind of happening concurrently here, we got some of these pictures. So this bottom picture on the left, this is the bombing of London. This is a picture, it's probably one of the more famous pictures of the attack on D-Day. So these are some of the American soldiers that are being shipped to the coast here. This picture up here, I think, gives you a good picture of the devastation of World War II in a lot of similar ways to World War I, as you can see. This is a map just of kind of the different forces as they're going through, eventually pushing up through Italy, into Germany, until eventually the Allies do force the surrender. So like I said, going on concurrently with the European front is the North African front. And this one is predominantly dominated by Italy. So Italy's goal kind of here for Mussolini was to retake some of the North African colonies that Italy had lost. The Allies are attempting to prevent this from happening, obviously, and capture control of Italy so that Germany will be down an ally. This is also known as the Italian campaign. Like I said, this is predominantly where we're fighting Italy. That's not to say that the Germans weren't there too. They were. In fact, one of the most famous German generals is there. The main operation that we have here is called Operation Torch. It is the Allied offensive that is attempting to force the German and Italian forces back into mainland Europe off of the control of North Africa and take control of Italy here. So some of the key people, the German leader named Erwin Rommel, he's in charge of the Afrika Corps. This is the main leader that we're fighting against. He's kind of the control of the North African campaign. For the United States, we start with a guy named George Patton, who got pretty famous in World War I. However, there is an incident which causes him to be removed from his position, and Dwight D. Eisenhower is put into his place. So I mentioned Eisenhower before as one of the planners of D-Day. Eisenhower really makes a big name for himself. The North African front, the Italian campaign, begins in June of 1940 and lasts until May of 1943. It ends when the Allies invade Sicily, and from Sicily the Allies are able to push into Italy, eventually making it to Rome, where they overthrow Mussolini and he is killed. And this leads to the fall of Italy and, of course, the fall of Germany's one major ally. So just some pictures here. You can see this guy right here. This is Rommel. So that's, again, the German leader we're fighting against. I think this one is always a really stunning picture, just this idea of the plains over the pyramids here. Obviously, this is mostly a desert-style war. A lot of it took place in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, these kind of countries that we are looking at here. And again, you can see from this map, it begins from kind of this area pushing through until we eventually get into Sicily. The next major front here that we are going to be looking at is the Soviet front. Now, it's important to remember, before the war had begun, Hitler had made a non-aggression pact with Stalin, who was in the charge of the Soviet Union. However, in 1941, Germany turns their back onto the Soviet Union and forces its way into the Soviet Union in order to take control. Basically, Hitler says this is just as much Lebensraum as anything else. We deserve to control Russia. 1941, Hitler launches what he calls Operation Barbarossa. It's kind of his like little baby attack. So like a lot of his leaders were like, dude, you ever read a history book? Do you know what happens when we invade Russia? Like, this is probably a really bad idea. However, Hitler really wanted to do it, so he did it anyway. This opens a two-front war for Hitler, which again, you think you would have learned from World War I that was a really bad idea. However, the Germans really saw themselves, especially Hitler, as better than the Russians, and so he's like, there's no way we're not going to win, right? Because they're Russian, they're ridiculous. This Operation Barbarossa is characterized as some intense brutality on the Russian people. Just like really nasty stuff goes on there. In fact, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is going to be a lot of the locations of the concentration camps, the death marches, the pogroms against Jews and other groups. So that's going to be a really major part of this. For the first year or so of his attack, Hitler does really well in Russia. However, in August of 1942, Hitler fights the Battle of Stalingrad, where basically what happens is the people there are burning the earth, right? So like, well, you're going to come in and take over. We're not going to let you be able to live off the land. So this is August. It's right before the winter, right? So they burn the crops. They burn the land around them so that as Hitler's troops starting to advance into the main part of the Soviet Union, it's going to be cold. It's going to be hard for them to find food. It's eventually going to be the downfall of Hitler's troops there in Germany until Stalin can push his men forward and push him back into Germany. The key people here are the Allies. We have Joseph Stalin, who, like I said, switches sides as soon as he's invaded by Hitler. For the Axis powers, we obviously have Hitler. It begins in June of 1941 and officially ends with the end of the war in May of 1945. This is obviously an Allied victory. And the Soviet Union goes on to occupy most of Eastern Europe, places that had been taken over by Hitler. They're going to go on to say, nope, this is ours now. So just some pictures here. This just showed you kind of the harsh climate. This is the burning of Moscow down here at the bottom. These are some Soviet troops. This particular photo is the corpse of a German soldier that had been turned upside down in the snow by some of the Soviet men as kind of a warning to other German soldiers. You can see that, you know, his uniform is destroyed, he doesn't have any boots anymore, and then, like I said, that's just kind of a warning to the rest of the German soldiers, like, you don't want to deal with Russia, right? Because we are going to kick your butts, and our winner is going to do the job for us, right? So this just kind of, again, shows you the location of the troops on the Eastern Front. The Pacific Front. So this is going to be primarily fought between the U.S. and Japan. And our major goal here is to push through the Pacific Islands up into the Japanese mainland. So there's a few major battles here that you need to know. The first is in 1942, the Battle of Coral Sea. The Battle of Coral Sea stops the Japanese attempt to take over Australia. In June of 1942, we fight the Battle of Midway. Up until this point, Japan had been pretty strong in the Pacific. However, this is a U.S. victory. It serves as a turning point for us. In August of 1842, the Battle of Guadalcanal is our first defeat of the Japanese on land. We begin at this point what we call a leapfrogging strategy. So the leapfrogging strategy basically means we're going to island hop. So the Pacific, when you look at it, and we'll look at a map in just a second, is mostly islands, right? So essentially what we are doing here is going from island to island. Think about if you've ever played leapfrog as a kid, you know, you kind of hop over. So eventually what we're going to be doing is hopping up to mainland Japan, and hopefully from an island off the coast of Japan we'll be able to invade and be able to take over. In January of 1945, we retake the Philippines. The Philippines have been taken by the Japanese just after Pearl Harbor. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf is where we take them. Douglas MacArthur is in charge of the Philippines here, so this is going to be a really big deal. This is also where Japan begins its strategy of kamikaze pilots. So kamikaze, if you don't know what that is, it's essentially a suicide pilot, where what they do is they will fly their planes into the side of American ships. That way the entire ship basically explodes. I mean, it's a bomb, essentially. And so this is something that's pretty devastating, and it really kind of shows the Americans the extent of what the Japanese are willing to do for this war. In March, we began the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. So these two islands are just off the coast of mainland Japan, and by winning these two islands, we gain the position to invade Japan. However, the fighting had become so intense by this point that we realize how difficult it really is going to be to invade mainland Japan. At this point, the numbers were estimated into the millions of men, 100,000 to 1 million American lives, and more, if not the same amount of Japanese men would have been killed. The Japanese were basically willing to do whatever it took to win. There's a big honor system in Japan that made them to be almost more ferocious fighters than we were. And at this point, the president had a hard decision to make. So FDR had passed away. He had been elected for a 4th term, and not long after he was reelected, passed away of coronary embolism. And his vice president, Harry Truman, is now in charge. So Harry Truman is trying to decide what we're going to be doing. He's getting these statistics, and he knows it's going to be hard to invade mainland Japan. And somebody comes up to him and is like, hey, President Truman, we have this like secret project we've been working on, Manhattan Project. And we've developed these really, really intense bombs. It's going to have negative effects, but it might end us the war. So Harry Truman goes to Japan, tells them, look, we've got these bombs, we're going to use them, okay? Will you surrender? Japanese Emperor Hirohito whether he's thinking he's kidding or doesn't know, he says, no, absolutely not. We're never surrendering. The first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The effects of the atomic bomb are devastating, as you will see in just a minute. It's terrible. Truman comes to Hirohito. We've got 2 more. We're going to drop the next one. Will you surrender? No, not going to do it. On August 9th, 1945, we drop the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The devastation is so intense that Hirohito is forced to surrender. This is the official end of the war. We had defeated Germany in May of that year. By September 2nd, Japanese had officially surrendered on VJ Day, which is Victory in Japan Day, September 2nd, 1945. This is the decisive Allied victory. This is the end of the war. So the key people, as you can see here, we've got Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, obviously the 2 presidents involved. Chiang Kai-shek is the leader of China. China was our allies. Japan had invaded China, and they were kind of our Asian allies in this side of the war. We were much stronger than China, but they're going to be an important ally later, so don't forget that name, Chiang Kai-shek. And then we have the Axis powers in this are Emperor Hirohito and then Tojo, who we've talked about quite a bit, who is the leader of the Japanese military. So the Pacific Front and the dropping of the atomic bomb is going to be the official end of the war. So just a couple photos here. This shows you just kind of how intense the fighting in Japan was. You can see up here this using a skull to basically say you don't want to hang out here. They're Japanese snipers. You better move on. This is, I believe, Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. This picture is probably one of the most famous pictures to come out of the war. This is raising the flag over Iwo Jima when we took over Iwo Jima there. So again, this is a map. You can really see how we are doing this. Is going to be the island hopping. So this is Pearl Harbor and Midway, Coral Sea down here in Australia. And essentially what we're doing is we're just hopping up through, right, these major islands. There's the Philippines, Battle of Manila. This is Iwo Jima, Okinawa. You can see how close we are to mainland Japan here. You can see where Nagasaki and Hiroshima are. And this is going to be the official end of World War II. So I can take off my helmet. We're going to kind of get to see the outcome of the war and what really the major effects are in the next video. So I will see you guys later. Goodbye.